structure my presentation. One moment, now it works. According to the typical simulation chain that we use, that means that we first describe the source, then step over to the sound propagation part, and finally talk about the exposure assessment. I will address the first two topics only very briefly, and source modeling I will talk about traffic noise, which is in most cases the most important source to take into consideration. About the exposure assessment, I would like to discuss two questions: which acoustic metric is used to describe the exposure and which simplifications are necessary to get there, and the second one, what is the location of the exposure that is typically assigned to. And finally, I would like to address a last point, which for me is a bit the elephant in the room, something that is very important but normally not spoken about in my perception. Traffic modeling, how it is done, has a major impact on the accuracy that we can achieve with our modeling. So let's jump right into road traffic noise emissions. I will just give you a brief overview about the two main sources there are. One of them is engine noise, which depends on the engine speed and the engine load primarily, and the engine load then again depends on acceleration and whether you are driving on a sloped road or not. So this is one of the two sources. The second one is the rolling noise, which depends on the vehicle speed. And the tire properties are width, profile, and temperature, which play a role. And then, as it is an interaction with the surface, it also depends on pavement properties. For example, texture and porosity are key parameters here. These three figures here show you the contribution of these two sources in dependence of the speed for three vehicle types: classical passenger cars, motorcycles, and trucks. And these figures are taken from the Swiss road traffic noise model SONROAD 18, and they are valid for driving at constant speeds. So if you accelerate, then of course the engine noise can be much more prominent compared to rolling noise. But what we see is on the left side for passenger cars, already at comparably low speeds, the rolling noise dominates the overall exposure sound emission. You see here in blue the rolling noise, and the engine noise is only for motorcycles and for trucks relevant at typical urban speeds around 50 kilometers per hour. But as I already said, be careful in cases of acceleration, which is very common in typical urban situations with stop and goes. This can change. When we now move on to the sound propagation phenomena, we already had our source characteristics, and then there's a long list of effects that you could or should take into account when propagating sound. So geometrical spreading is the first one. So this is just the mere fact that sound levels decrease with increasing distance. And this is, by the way, the only effect which is not frequency depending. All following effects are frequency depending. We have dissipation, so the air absorption, ground effects, which is the interaction of the direct wave with the wave reflected on the ground, barrier effects, reflections, for example, at another building, vegetation, which can have an attenuating effect, but also a reflecting one, even though these reflections are very weak. And finally, meteorological effects. Now, these individual effects are typically modeled more or less independently of each other, even though in reality they interact. For example, ground effects and barrier effects cannot be separated from each other. For practical applications, not all of these effects are relevant in all cases. For example, At shorter ranges, geometrical spreading, barrier effects, ground effects, and reflections will do the trick, and the other effects are typically of minor relevance. However, if you do long-range propagation, meteorological effects can become much more important, and also dissipation gains importance. Talking about meteorological effects, if you average over time, they average more each other out. So you have conditions which lead to increased levels, and others that lead to a decrease of exposure levels. However, what you have to bear in mind is that you have a systematic difference between the stratification of the atmosphere during the day compared to the night. So typically during the night you have more favorable propagation conditions than during the day. So after this short overview of the effects, I would like to have a look at the major challenges in modeling and also the sources of uncertainty. For the emission modeling, we did a few years ago a sensitivity analysis, which helps us to estimate the uncertainty you get because of specific effects. Some of the first part of these effects are linked to traffic, so traffic volume, traffic mix, which vehicle categories are actually on the road, how they are distributed over the lanes, and also the speed regime have a certain influence. And you can see with these estimates here, you can estimate their effect on an overall level. Then you have additional effects which are quite important. On the one hand, temperature, and on the other hand, the pavement type. And this one is a rather crucial one, and I would say the most important source of uncertainty in road traffic modeling. From a low noise pavement to a rather bad pavement, you can have up to 10 decibels difference in pass-by levels. Of course, for average standard pavements, the difference is smaller, but still this is a major source of uncertainty. When we go to the propagation modeling, there I cannot give any quantification of uncertainties because this highly depends on the specific situations. But major challenges are the accuracy and completeness of input data. So are all buildings there, are noise barriers mapped, and for example also the land use types that decide whether a certain surface is acoustically hard, like a pavement, or whether you have grassland. This can have quite an impact. Then also from buildings and noise barriers, for example, material properties play a role, like reflectivity and scattering behavior. And what is also in most cases a major challenge are meteorological conditions, which are at least not known on a short-term basis. And finally, the propagation model that you use has an effect too. I show here a comparison that we did where we compared our own model Sonics with the Knossos model and two settings of the ISO 9613 Part 2 model with two different ground reflection settings. And you see here box whisker plots for 72 propagation situations that we compared with a finite difference time domain reference model. And what you can see is that on the one hand, you can have a systematic deviation from this reference model, but also you have quite a spread within the data set. So the boxes cover a range of 2 to 3 decibels. So as an interim conclusion, already sound emission and sound propagation modeling introduce quite a substantial amount of uncertainty in your exposure assessment. Now, let's go on to the part about the exposure assessment and the acoustic metric we are typically looking at. What you see here is the steps that are taken when analyzing sound recordings, and the modeling at least partially follows this path. So Sound, very generally spoken, is a quick change of the ambient sound pressure, and this is what a microphone measures, so pressure over time. The first step is always to transform this in a level, so in a value in a decibel range, and you have then the two dimensions, time and frequency. And there are some high-end engineering models that actually can reproduce these both dimensions, and how this looks like is often shown as a spectrogram. As you see here, this is a aircraft pass by shown in a spectrogram, where you see time on the x-axis, the frequency on the y-axis, and the amplitude given in the coloring. This is the measurement, and here is the corresponding modeling. So you can see that there are models that are able actually to reproduce these two dimensions. And it does make sense or it helps to improve the quality of your modeling if you calculate frequency dependent. However, the final step in most cases that you apply the so-called A weighting. So this weights specific frequencies according to the sensitivity of our hearing, and sums it all up to a single value. And you see here the same flyover modeled and measured in comparison with this single value over time, this A-weighted level over time. Now, a second compression step that is in most cases done, and which some engineering models directly aim for, namely the road traffic noise models, for example, is that you average over time and get the long-term equivalent, the LAQ. And this averaging over time is typically done for different parts of the day. So for example, in the day, evening, night level, you do it for 12 hours of the day, 4 hours of the evening, and 8 hours of the night, and penalize evening and night with 5 and 10 decibels respectively. And as you do this for yearly average conditions, you end up with a single number that describes the sound of the sound exposure that you would perceive during the entire year. So it's quite a brutal reduction of data, and it's quite obvious that this huge compression does not come with a certain loss of information. When we now move on to the question, which is the best suited location for the exposure assessment? Of course, if you look at the daily behavior of people, they go to work, have leisure activities, they change place all the time. But normally you don't follow the exposure during the day. But what you do is that you look only at the place of residence, and the reason for this is a pretty simple one, that legislation only protects the place of residence. But still, there's the question, which specific location close to home is the right one? And in that context, ETH did in a recent survey a nice questioning. They asked the classical question in the past 12 months, how disturbed or annoyed have you felt by road traffic noise in the following situations, and gave the participants different options that you see here. So they asked about road traffic noise in general, road traffic noise in front of the house, in the garden, or on the balcony, in the house with open windows, or in the house with closed windows. And if we focus on the highly annoyed, so those that gave a 8, 9, or 10 in the scale, we see that the assessment in general is matching very nicely with the assessment participants gave in front of the house, in the garden, on the balcony, or in the house with the open window situation. So at least annoyance is triggered by the situation in the open with an open window, not the pure inner room situation with a closed window. So it was, at least in Switzerland, decided to choose as a point of determination, the middle of open windows, and from a practical point of view, this is often replaced with a facade point. Now the question is still which facade point is the right one, and the question is always whether it is the most exposed or the least exposed facade. And we did a comparison about or studied the influence of these two options in the CBEN project, where we calculated the exposure of the least and the most exposed facade and compared this to high annoyance and sleep disturbance. And what you see on the left for high annoyance is that the exposure response curves match quite nicely, regardless of the level difference between the front and the back side of the building. So the conclusion is here that the most exposed facade is best suited to predict daytime exposure. However, at night, it does make a difference whether your bedroom has an access to the quiet side or not. So these curves are clearly off, and the offset nicely matches with the measured level difference between the front and the back side. So at night, the bedroom window is decisive, and this is often at the least exposed facade. However, you cannot be sure about that, but this has quite an impact. So with this picture here, I would like to discuss a few more aspects of these facade points. It is an example taken from the city of Zurich, from the official noise mapping, the recent one, which I will also show later on some more results. And you see the facade points, green dots mean, or green diamonds mean that the noise limits are kept, and red diamonds mean that the noise limits are exceeded by 5 dB or more. So between green and red, you have a difference of 5 dB. And what we, for example, see when we look here around the corner, by the way, this is Bellevue Square, one of the most, well, the biggest squares in the city of Zurich. So you see here just around the corner, whether you are on a busy road or a slightly less busy road, you can have a deviation of several decibels. Very important is also the height of the floor. So it can change for 5 dB or more if you whether you are in one of the upper floors or whether you are close to the road. And also the aspect of the orientation can be well seen, whether you are aiming towards the street or if you are especially in such a inner courtyard situation. This can have a major impact on your exposure. But now let's come to the last point, influence of the traffic modeling. What I said, the elephant in the room, the aspect that is not yet discussed in enough detail in my perception. I will also discuss this based on an example. We have access to two modelings of the city of Zurich. One is taken from the Sun-based, the nationwide noise mapping done by the Federal Office for the Environment, last done for the year 2015, and the recent update of the noise pollution register of the city of Zurich for the year 2020. Those two modelings are done based on current standards. They are done well, but they have some pros and cons, so some weaknesses and strengths. So the Sun-based modeling has as a strength that it considers all roads, also smaller ones. In total, the number of kilometers in the network is about twice as large as the one from the city of Zurich. And it also has a more modern, a more sophisticated agent-based traffic model. A weakness, however, is that the emission model is a simpler one, which only distinguishes passenger cars and others, so just two groups. Then on the Zurich side, the focus is only on roads above certain threshold traffic volume, so all other roads are just ignored. And however, for these roads that are considered, the data is probably more accurate, as they did a lot of own additional countings. And also the the modeling of the emission is better as it uses a more detailed vehicle categorization. And another additional beneficial point is the fact that they also modeled public transport, which was not the case for Sunbase. What is a major difference between the two approaches is the goal behind it. So for Sunbase, the goal was to characterize the noise exposure of the population, regardless whether noise limits are exceeded or not. However, for a noise pollution register, the goal is to identify situations with exceeded noise limits, and therefore the interest on these low exposure situations was pretty small. And this is, from my point of view, one of the major reasons why we see quite fundamental differences between the outcome of the two modelings. You see here, yes, I forgot to mention, they both have their weaknesses. What I would do better in a next step, they should account for the specific pavement properties, and they always assumed constant speed, which is for urban situations, well, not very accurate in some cases. But let's go on with the comparison of the data set. So we compared the facade points for 905 facade points we also used in a survey, and we're quite surprised to see quite substantial differences in the calculated exposure levels. Of course, there are other effects that played a role, as the mentioned differences in the emission models, but most of the differences could be assigned to the traffic modeling. So you see that the Zurich calculations tend to have more very high exposed situations, and also have these quite unrealistic low exposure situations, while the Sunbase calculation is somewhere more in between. Maybe a better representation is this scatter plot here, where we can see the differences better. We see, first of all, this huge spread, which can also be seen in the range of decibels that we have between the two calculations. Even though the mean deviation is very small, still the standard deviation is quite substantial. So what we see are these already mentioned unrealistically low exposure situations from the city of Zurich. This is just because they ignored those smaller roads and didn't assign any sound emissions there. But maybe, as these are just a handful of points, maybe more crucial for the result is the fact that we have, on general, higher levels at high exposure for the city of Zurich, but lower levels at mid exposure. And this has quite an effect on the resulting exposure response curves, depending on which data set you use. So be careful what the basis of your exposure modeling was that you are using for your analysis. So I'm coming to the discussion. So detailed knowledge about infrastructure, buildings and dwelling units is very important. And as just shown, traffic modeling is crucial and can be a major source of uncertainty. And as also shown, emission and propagation modeling introduce additional uncertainties. So to take home, as a take-home message, the accuracy is limited and typically lower at low exposure situations. What is potentially problematic is the fact that systematic biases between high and low exposure situations can occur, and with considerable consequences on the resulting effect estimates. So this, from my point of view, is one of the most crucial points. So exposure misclassification is a major issue. The recommendation is to really invest time in the exposure modeling, be critical about the results, and validate the models with measurements. Now, land use regression is also a topic. I'm personally never did a land use regression modeling, so I'm not an expert on that, but I have an opinion on it. In my perception, there are some strengths of land use regression modeling, for example, that it is directly based on measurements. which avoids many of the mentioned issues. For example, the fact that you don't know the pavement properties. And what is certainly, it is a chance, as it also allows the modeling in situations with scarce input data. However, road geometry is still needed. But still, what I've shown on in my slides are that you need a lot of details and a lot of input data, which is in many countries just not available. And so this is an alternative which is feasible when the first path is not. However, there are some weaknesses in my perception, so that when you are just based on measurements, the information on the type of sound source is missing. So this might be a feasible approach if you are very close to a busy road where the road traffic noise dominates the overall level, but you will not be able to propagate the contribution of this road further out as soon as other sources will become relevant. Another point is that it yields free field levels at constant height above ground. So all these discussions about the importance of facade points, this differentiation is not feasible. And in general, as I try to show you, sound exposure is spatially highly variable, and abrupt changes are very common in densely built environments. Whether you are in front of a building or in the back, you can have a 15, 20 decibels difference. So the measurement network cannot be dense enough in my participation to account for that, and an interpolation is often not valid, therefore. So my conclusion is that the classical approach remains the gold standard for high quality exposure assessment, and really land use regression modeling is just plan B if there are no alternatives. And with this, I will end my presentation, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jean-Marc. So we have some time for a few questions.
Even though I was a bit too long, right? Sorry for that.
Oh, no, you were actually on time, given that, we started late.
Okay, good.
You're on time. So I think we have time for maybe a few questions. So feel free to raise your hand, or you can just, shout out your question. Like there's some questions, some comments in the chat.
First one, I'm studying the combined effects of air pollution and noise exposure on health outcomes. Given your expertise in noise exposure, would you be open to discussing potential collaboration? Okay. Sure. Haha. Okay, this is direct an offer for a collaboration. Yes, sure. Yeah. Then second.
And then Benjamin, great presentation, Jean-Marc. A comment rather than a question. Mm-hmm. We tested the influence of noise modeling input parameters on burden of disease of noise in London as a sensitivity analysis. And it was done by Gunn, Marie, and colleagues for Nordic countries.
Oh, so, thank you very much. Yes. I will download it and read it. Yeah, perfect.
And it looks like what I saw. Oh, Meta, I think has a question also.
Yeah, thank you, Jean-Marc. Very good overview, I think, of this really difficult topic of estimating their exposure correctly. And I completely agree also with this, that the traffic modeling is really the dark horse here. So do you have any ideas on how we should actually improve these traffic modeling? Because I don't even know. Also, another question is whether do you know whether EU has any demands to actually the traffic modeling that goes into their model? So that would be the first. And the second, how do we actually improve traffic modeling so we could get even better estimates?
Yes, about your first question, I'm not a specialist in that field. I could only see that over time, with each new calculation of the national noise register, values changed rather abruptly, which could not be explained by the overall growth in traffic over years. It was really a consequence of the different modeling approaches. So far, this agent-based modeling approach, where you have your counting stations to normalize the overall traffic, but you assign a certain amount of induced traffic for each type of business and for housing areas. For me, is still the best approach, specifically as it also distributes traffic to lower roads. And I think our problem when we are trying to model effect sizes is that we need a reference to compare with. And if the levels at low exposure are so highly uncertain, we just have no good ground to start with. But about EU, I don't know.
And it looks like we have a question from, apologies, Zhendong.
Yes, hi, thanks for the talk. It's very impressive. I just wondering, do you think it would be like feasible to kind of measure the noise by the mobile platform? For example, put a noise meter on a moving cars.
Yes, you have some issues with noise-induced sound induced by the wind itself. But I saw that Luc is here. He has a lot of experience in this and might comment on that.
Well, yeah, thank you for thinking about me on that case. But I did a lot of work on measuring noise on bicycle. And then you actually capture the local variation in traffic spectrally and at a location that is relevant for actual exposure throughout your network. Measuring on cars is much more difficult because your car is a source in its own. We did experiments like that in Antwerp on cars of the Post organization, and that actually failed. So, but measuring mobility with on bicycles is very efficient and adds a lot of value.
Yeah, exactly. And our question is mostly regarding to remove the wind, because if you drive the car with a bit of even in the moderate speed, like 30 or 40 kilometer per hour, still those probably it's a bit hard to remove the impact of the wind to kind of preserve the kind of surrounding environment noise.
Yes.
I just wondering, do you know if this is a way we can remove by the hardware, or is there any kind of software we could do that? Or probably this is more complicated and we can communicate later by the email or something.
So you propose to get rid of the wind-induced noise by later signal processing?
Yeah, both of the ways.
Yeah,
if there's
no.
any solution from the hardware or the software.
I would rather go for better windscreens. There are windscreens that can really do a good job. I would say 30 kilometers per hour is still feasible with a specially designed windscreen. The problem is the wind-induced noise is low frequent and is very broadband, so it will cover the rest of your signal. So once you have it on your recording, you're lost. Sorry for that.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you so much again, Jean-Marc, for your presentation. And we're going to go ahead and move to our next speaker. So, Junette.
Hi, I have the privilege of introducing our next speaker. I just want to say to everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you are. I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Mette Sorensen. Dr. Sorensen is a senior researcher at the Danish Cancer Society Research Center in Copenhagen and a professor of the Department of Natural Science and Environment at Roskilde University in Denmark. So Dr. Sorensen's research focuses on the health effects of transportation noise, looking at the link between noise and a variety of conditions. So Mette has covered stroke, myocardial infarction, type 2 diabetes, obesity, breast and colon cancer, infertility, dementia, so a wide scope. She has led the Nord Sound project, which brought together the Nordic cohorts to examine the combined effects of a number of urban exposures, so looking at transportation noise, but also air pollution, lack of green space on disease risk. Finally, Dr. Sorensen is the co-chair of the next event, which I hope all of you will attend, and this will be held in Copenhagen in 2026. Dr. Sorensen, if you want to share your slide.
Oops. Okay. So you see my screen now, right?
Yes, yes, we do.
Okay,
Yes, we do.
Great, perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction, and also thank you very much for arranging this great webinar. What better way to spend your afternoon than listening to talks about noise, my favorite subject, and also really grateful for that you invited me. So within the next 20-25 minutes, I will try to give you an overview about what we know about health effects of transportation noise. And I will, of course, also show you a number of examples of what we did in Denmark on this. So I will focus my talk on road traffic noise because road traffic noise is by far the most frequent environmental exposure that we have. And just to give you an idea of how many people that are actually exposed, in the latest END estimation, which estimates every 5th year how many people are exposed to noise in Europe, it was estimated that at least 20% of the population were exposed over 55 decibel, and these 55 decibel is the European threshold, measuring threshold. But it's very likely that it's underestimated, and I can show you why over here. Let's just see if we can get this. Because this is kind of the most recent EEA report. This is actually a new one. It was from 25. And what you can see here is actually what the EU estimates when they estimate road traffic noise. They estimate what they call urban agglomeration, which corresponds to cities with more than 100,000 persons, so and so. It depends a bit also from country to country. And then they also, besides that, estimate really the major roads, so the state roads in a country. And you can see here how a noise map of EU then actually looks. All the dots are the agglomerations which has been estimated. So find your country and see whether only where the dots are also where the noise are. At least for Denmark, I can say that these 4 cities that are estimated in Denmark are not at all covering all the people that are exposed to noise. So just shortly, why do we think that noise at all can be harmful? We think that there are 2 main mechanisms that are important here. First of all, if you're exposed, it may activate the stress response, which in the end leads to increased levels of cortisol and adrenaline. And what is at least as important is that if you're exposed to noise during nighttime, it may actually affect your sleep, which we know could be harmful also. So both stress response and disturbance of sleep may, if you're exposed also chronically, lead to an increase in a number of biological risk factors. For example, cardiovascular disease. These are the ones that are by far most investigated. For example, a lot of studies have shown that if you're exposed to traffic noise, you will have an endothelial dysfunction, which is one of the main risk factors for cardiovascular disease. but it may also increase a number of other risk factors. For example, for obesity, diabetes, we know if you have a poor sleep, then you have an increased risk of these two conditions. Also, there are potential risk factors for neurodegenerative diseases like dementia and Parkinson's disease, and also potential risk factors for cancer. So what do we know about health impacts of noise? The latest report from the EU, or from the European Environment Agency, EEA, came in 2020. A new one is coming, I think, within the next weeks or months, but it's very close to coming. But this is the most recent so far. And in this one, they estimated that based on the knowledge they had at that time, there were at least 12,000 additional cases of premature death. There were almost 50,000 persons having an ischemic heart disease due to noise, and then a lot of people suffering from sleep disturbance and annoyance. But I think it's important here to just say that this evaluation was based on the WHO evaluation from 2018, which evaluated the evidence from until 2015. So already in 2020, it was sure that we needed more research in this area. So this is why we started a large study in Denmark, where we focused on the entire Danish population. So far we've focused on people of 35 years and more, because they are the ones, you can say, the diseases we look at are diseases that you get relatively late in life. We follow these persons up from 2000 to 2017 right now. We want, of course, to follow up longer at a later point in time, and that gave us a population on 3.6 million persons. And in Denmark, everybody has this this is our social security card. You get it when you are born, and it follows you until you die. And on this, you have this 10-digit number that allows us to link between all the administrative and health registries that we have in Denmark. And that's really a lot, and I will show you some of them. One registry that we use a lot is the CPR registry, which holds complete, precise address history for all people living in Denmark, actually dating back to 1970. In this study, we focused on noise from 1990. So we had complete address history for all of this population from 1990 until 2017. All these addresses were sent to a noise consultant who estimated traffic noise at all addresses. I will show you how later. And I can already assure you it's not the land use regression models. Then also we sent all these addresses to Aarhus University, who estimated air pollution. So all our models are adjusted for air pollution. Then we are able to go into these registry for this population. We are able to link to a number of different diseases using our health registries. And these are just some of the health registries we have been using. We have a hospital registry who registers both in and outpatients, all in and outpatients in Denmark since 1978. So we are able to follow all admissions to hospital. We have a mortality registry, a prescription registry, so every medication redeemed from a pharmacy we also have information on, and we have, of course, a cancer registry. And then also we want in all our models to adjust for socioeconomic status. So for that we have a number of registries at Statistik Denmark, which has individual level information. And it's not only individual level, it's individual level yearly information. So for each year we know the income of all people in Denmark. We know their highest level of education, their marital status, their occupation, and their ethnicity. So all the results you will see are adjusted for these. So to the noise exposure assessment, we used the Nordic prediction method, which is an acoustical model that has been used and validated for many years, especially in the Nordic countries. Input variables in this model are already Jean-Marc told us a bit about that, but what we included was both the geochord, also the height, as Jean-Marc showed. There are different noise levels the further up you go in these multi-story buildings. So we also have height in our model. Screening from other buildings, from noise barriers, from terrain are also included. Reflections from building to building are included in the model. And then we actually spent, I think we spent 5-6 years on collecting this traffic data. So for Denmark, so we called basically all the municipalities to get this information for as many roads as possible. So for all road lines in Denmark, we have information on the traffic composition, the yearly average daily traffic, the traffic speed at different times of the day, and also the road type. And based on that, we got an estimate for LDN, so the kind of an average level of noise over the day. So to the results, this is actually how Denmark looks when you have estimated noise for all of Denmark. You have here kind of the capital, Copenhagen, and what we find, this is kind of the distribution for noise at the most exposed facade, and we found a median on 57 decibel, meaning that 50% of our population are exposed to more than 57 decibels. And if we compare with what the EU estimates for Denmark, this is for the end measurements, you can see what I also tried to point out in the first slide that I had, that in Denmark you estimate only, for the EU, estimate at the 4 major cities in Denmark, and then you estimate at the road. So everything outside of this is just no noise at all. So this is how EU calculations look like, and this is how calculation look like when you actually calculate at all addresses. In our study, we calculated noise at both the most and the least exposed facade, and here you can see a view of how that looked in, this is the most exposed facade in Copenhagen and the least exposed facade, and you can see actually inner Copenhagen gets quite silent when we talk about the least exposed facade, and that's because we have a lot of these close courtyards in Denmark where it is really silent and noise from the traffic actually doesn't go into these courtyards. And as Jean-Marc also mentioned, we see this as mainly a proxy for exposure during sleep, because a lot of people, if they have the possibility, they will choose to have a bedroom facing away from a busy street. And actually the correlation between most and least exposed facade aren't that high. We also estimated air pollution. I won't at all go into details, but as this was together with ISEE, I was sure that a lot of people would sit wondering about air pollution. So just to say that we have a really advanced model, a multi-scale exposure model, where we calculate exposure both at street, urban, and regional background level and sum it up to get also here a 5 and 10 year time weighted average of both PM2.5 and NO2. So our results are adjusted for this. And then this is just to give an idea of the size or the power we have in this study population. So if we look at cardiovascular disease, we found in our hospital and mortality registries more than 100,000 cases with ischemic heart disease, almost 50,000 with heart failure, more than 180,000 cases with stroke, and you can see for diabetes it's even higher. We had more than 200,000. So just to say that in this study we had have an incredibly high power because we have so many cases. So to the results, first for cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So just to walk you through this table, what you see here are results for ischemic heart disease. And for heart failure, you see the results here for the most exposed facade and for the least exposed facade. And here you see the crude and the adjusted results. And all results are given per 10 dB higher road traffic noise, a 10-year average of this. And if we look at ischemic heart disease here as the most exposed facade, you can see that a 10 dB higher road traffic noise increases the risk of ischemic heart disease by 5%. And actually, we don't see that much difference between noise at the most and at the least exposed facade for ischemic heart disease. When we go down here and look at heart failure, we actually found a stronger association with noise at the least exposed facade, which indicates, or at least could indicate, that exposure during nighttime may be important mechanisms when it comes to developing heart failure. And this is just to show you that if we add in adjustment for PM2.5, it actually, the results are really robust to further adjustment by air pollution. And here you can see all the things that we adjust for in the models. And here you see the same results, but just shown in as dose response curves. Here you have road traffic noise. Here you have risk, and in pink you can see the results for road traffic noise at the most exposed facade, and in blue at the least exposed facade. And I think what is the important take-home message here is to follow the curve here. If we look at the most exposed facade, which you can say is most important in a regulatory perspective, because this is what EU uses, this is what are used for making thresholds. But what you can see is that there are, if we look at, for example, EU have a level here, 55 decibel. It's just to say that there are not at all, in our studies at least, any magical limit here around 55 decibel, below which there are no effects of noise. Actually, in our study, there seemed to be an effect throughout the exposure range. So, yeah. And now to type 2 diabetes. For now, I will show only results as exposure-response relationships, but here you have the corresponding adjusted hazard ratios. For diabetes, we found associations both with noise at the most exposed facades, the pink curve here, and at the least exposed facade, the blue curve. And as you can see also on the curve, we found much stronger association with exposures at the least exposed facade, which fits really well with this previous findings that sleep is really important for developing type 2 diabetes. So it goes well with what we already know about risk factors for type 2 diabetes. And I'm sure a lot of you are now sitting and thinking, yeah, it's an administrative study and all these findings are because there are residual confounding due to lifestyle. And I've received this comment so many times in the review process. So I actually did a study to investigate whether there was a problem with residual confounding from lifestyle. And I did that using a cohort we have in Denmark, where we have almost 300,000 participants randomly selected across Denmark. And in this cohort, when I did the study, there were 7,500 incident type 2 diabetes cases. And what we did then was that we looked at the association here with road traffic noise at the most exposed facade. And here you see results for the crude model and for the model adjusted for socioeconomic status in exactly the same way as we do in our administrative study. And this is actually also exactly the same estimate as we get in the large nationwide study. And what happens then when we adjust for a number of different lifestyle habits from a questionnaire, you can see it basically doesn't affect the risk estimates that much. So it lowers it a bit, so there might be a bit of residual confounding, but it's really not a major issue, it seems, at least not for diabetes. So we also, as was said in the introduction, looked at a number of new adverse health outcomes in a noise context. And one of the things that we looked on was breast cancer. Here, of course, we restricted our population to look only at women. And we had 66,000 cases, and Here you can see the result for road traffic noise at the most exposed facade. You can see we found really not a convincing association. This hazard ratio, although significant, it was really low. And also this exposure response relationship was not convincing. There might be something here at their highest exposure levels. But when we look at noise at the least exposed facade, we see a much nicer dose-response relationship from around 50 decibel and up, and also a stronger hazard ratio, which again indicates that this effect of noise during nighttime may be particularly important, which again fits well with what we thought were potential mechanisms, which is this disruption of the circadian rhythm, which we know is a strong risk factor for breast cancer. So we also looked into these neurodegenerative diseases. We looked into dementia, and here you see the results in pink for the most exposed facade, in blue for the least exposed facade. And what you can see here is we find an association for both these measures of noise. Again, no lower threshold here. But what we see is this kind of strange leveling off here at high exposure levels, which has also been seen by others. And we also saw it for other outcomes. For example, we saw the same for stroke. And we actually looked a bit more into this. This is the results from here. What we did is for the least exposed facade, we separated the population in 3 different subpopulations. The ones living with low population density, those living in, you can say, more rural areas, and here medium density and high density. And what we could see was that there were no leveling off in the more rural areas. This was a thing that happened in the urban areas. And that led us to conclude that the leveling off could be due to masking of noise by community noise sources like neighborhood noise from restaurants in urban areas. And also that people living at high exposure levels, they actually invest in sound insulation, not only due to noise from traffic, but due to all the different types of noise that are in urban environments. So to some brand new results that basically just came out of my computer, we have tried to look more into other neurodegenerative diseases, and this is the results for Parkinson's disease, where you can see again the results. If we start here with noise at the least exposed facade, you can see we find actually a nice dose-response relationship and hazard ratio on 1.04 per interquartile range increase, which is around 9 decibel. So for noise at the least exposed facade, it looks pretty nice. But when we look then at noise at the most exposed facade, we see, similar to what we saw for dementia, this strange leveling off. And it's not even a leveling off, it's actually a decrease at higher levels. So we try to look a bit more into this now in another way, because I've for a long time thought about looking into this thing with the delta noise. So the difference between noise at the most and the least exposed facade, because you can say if you have the high delta noise, you will kind of have a way of actually escaping exposure, high noise exposure. So what I did was that I tried to actually adjust the results here at the most exposed facade. I adjusted them for delta noise, so the difference between noise at the most and least exposed facade, as an indicator of whether you have a silent facade that you can escape at or not. And here you can see the results here. In pink, you see the old. It's completely the same as you saw in black before. And in blue, you can then see the association when we adjust for delta noise. And you can see this becomes much more linear. You still have something here at higher levels, but it definitely improves the linearity and the association. And also the hazard ratios goes up by double. So this indicates that that if we take into account the silent facade, whether you have it or not, it actually kind of improve our estimation of whether noise also at the most exposed facade is associated with the disease we want to look into. And I just wanted, I talked about this closed courtyards. It's just to say that this with the silent facade, it may be important in some countries and maybe not important in other countries. It's just if we look in Denmark, this is a Google map over Copenhagen, and what you can see is that, and this could be anywhere in Copenhagen, what we have are these really close courtyards. You can see like here, where you have actually no space between for the noise to go in. So they are actually really quiet. So there is a huge difference here between here and here, which will make this silent facade important. I also tried just to show you in another way. What I did here was to show you the associations. Again, noise at the most exposed facade, but this is the association with them that with people that don't have a silent facade, and you can see this is where we see a nice association. So if you are not able to escape, this is how the association looks like. If you have a high delta noise, so a large difference between your most and least exposed facade, this is where we see these more strange associations. So just kind of to wrap up, so in 2023, Martin Rösli, who will talk next, made this report together with the EEA and a lot of other collaborators. And what they concluded here was that based on not, of course, only our study, but all the epidemiological studies that have been made so far, that now there are enough evidence to conclude that there is an association with not only ischemic heart disease, as was in the last report, but also with stroke and heart failure, also with type 2 diabetes, with all-cause mortality, and with annoyance and sleep disturbance. And then there are a number of new potential adverse health outcomes that still need us to do a lot of research. So don't worry, there are work in this field for many years. So please step in and help us with looking at a lot of these new potential adverse health outcomes. And this is my last slide. So just some, I think, some important future discussions. I think what we need to look more into in future studies is this with identifying a lower harmful threshold for traffic noise, because we really don't know where this is yet. And also, for example, in these noise maps that EU makes, it's also, do we really want to focus on 55 decibel and up only when we actually see associations below? I think also it's important in the future to focus more on other noise measures than just noise at the most exposed facade. As I showed, this with the least exposed facade could be really relevant to look into, and there are a lot of other noise proxies that could be interesting to look into. And I think my last point was, I think the same as Jean-Marc's, that if you want to do epidemiological study, use these high quality estimations of noise. Or if you don't have access to these, you at least need to acknowledge that in your limitation session, because I have seen some examples of papers with relatively poor noise assessment, and it's really difficult if we want to kind of try to get the most accurate risk estimates, that we have these studies that are using a relatively poor exposure assessment. So with this, I will say thank you and are open for questions.
Thank you, Mette. I'm just going to read a couple from the chat, but if anybody has questions, if you want to raise your hand. So one question from Matthias says, in your Danish study for heart failure, the slope is higher for the least exposed facade. This is opposite to the effect described by Jean-Marc. Could you think of a reason for your opposite results?
I don't think they were opposite, actually. I don't know, Jean-Marc, if you think, but for example, for cardiovascular disease, we don't see any difference. Here we see that associations with the cardiovascular disease, at least with ischemic heart disease, we see the same for stroke. There we find similar associations, which I think maybe could fit more into that this with the stress mechanisms are very important for noise at the most exposures are this effect through stress, whereas for example, breast cancer and diabetes, where we know that sleep and effects on circadian rhythm may be particularly important, that the least exposed facade is kind of a better estimate to try to capture this. So in my opinion, I don't think that it was different. I think Jean-Marc showed associations with the people were annoyed. But I think that the mechanisms may simply be different from disease to disease.
Absolutely, I fully agree with you. And by the way, thank you for this excellent presentation, which perfectly matched to my own input. It is, as you said, it's whether the pathways through sleep or through daytime, and if it is through sleep, it is shown that the least exposed to facade seems to be better associated to the effect. So as you said, it's a better predictor. So I think we're fully in line.
Nice. So the next comment or question was made by I apologize for my pronunciation, Zare Zakviri, and it said, "Thank you for a great presentation. Given the emerging evidence on environmental noise in the context of carcinogenesis, mostly from Denmark, should we discuss environmental noise as an initiator, a promoter, or perhaps another category of carcinogenic agents?" Yeah,
I don't. That's a good question. I think definitely we need more research in this. I must say we haven't thought about what part of the carcinogenesis that this works on. For now, I think we discuss this with the circadian rhythm, that it may disrupt this, which we know already is potential mechanisms. But please step in, make some animal studies so that we can, because I think this is really also a need in this field, that we have much more mechanistic studies, which are so rare at present. So we really need more mechanistic studies.
And I think a follow-up question, and if you want to open up your mic and ask the second question, but the same person is asking, for cancer as an outcome, do you think physical activity should be considered as a confounder?
Yeah, definitely. For some of it depends on the cancer type. For breast cancer, I don't think it's so relevant, but at least for some of the others, like colon cancer, physical activity would be relevant to include. So, but as shown in this study, where we tried to add in all the lifestyle, it really doesn't affect the estimates that much, which kind of indicates that with our social economic status indicators, we actually already adjust a lot, also for the, which is in a kind of a way of trying to adjust for lifestyle also in an indirect way.
Gia, you have your hand raised if you want to unmute and ask the question.
Sure. Thank you so much for giving me these opportunities. So first of all, you don't need to read my question. Will you be open to a collaborative opportunity to apply the same methods to study the U.S. population or conduct a cross-population study?
Sure, you can try to write. I think my email was on the last
Yes, I read it
slide.
down.
So please just send me an email.
Yes, thank you so much. Okay, so further, my question is, a lot of the diseases, the health outcomes you are focusing, like diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, genetically related, like a genetic is a major factor. Have you ever think of maybe control for, do you have like the genetic information, such as I think UK have biobank, like that information to the analysis to say, if the effect measurement will be changed?
We haven't tried that. I haven't even really seen convincing examples of people looking at this. But again, everything within this mechanistic, trying to establish some of these mechanistic pathways would be really, really welcome, because we need so much information here. So we haven't studied it, but for sure we would like to study it.
Yeah, cause I'm really excited. I want to share.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in.
Oh, sorry. Can you just finish this sharing and then you can jump in? So I'm really excited to share my study result that for women who have a maternal family history of hypertension, so possibly genetically prone to hypertension, when they exposed to noise during pregnancy, they have a much higher risk of having preterm birth. So that when women have a hypertensive disorders during pregnancy, out of a clinic, the only way to stop that is to get the baby out. So when people are genetically predisposed to those diseases, they will have a higher risk. They were more sensitive to noise exposure. So that's what I'm thinking there. Maybe after you control for genetic factor, the effect estimate will be a little bit higher. Yeah. So sorry to interrupt. Please come in, join.
Thank you, Gia. I think we'll turn it over to Daniel. We'll have to cut it off now because we have a third speaker and we're running out of time. So sorry, Danielle, if you would.
Well, I would thank you, Mette. I think you're not sharing anymore. So Martin, if you can start your share while I do a quick introduction of you. This is Professor Martin Rusli. He's at Swiss Tropical Public Health Institute, the head of the unit there on exposures, environmental exposures and health. And so he has been researching noise for quite some time now, and he's very fascinated by the interaction of physical exposures with human health in generally, but specifically noise and non-ionizing radiation. So he's done a lot of studies on exposure assessment, also epidemiological research, and health impact assessment studies. And he's served on a variety of different national and international public health organizations and committees, also including the Swiss Federal Noise Abatement Commission. So it's my pleasure to hand over now to you, Martin.
Thanks a lot for the nice introduction. I hope you can see now the slides in full text mode. I'm also very pleased that I'm able to present on this subject today. I've been recently invited for the Urban Sound Symposium where I gave a similar talk, and between I was invited to, let's see whether it moves forward, to the European Arteriosclerosis Society. They had their annual meeting in Glasgow beginning of May, and they really wanted to have a session on 21st century risk factors and invited me to give an overview about noise health effects. And I gave a similar talk like Mette has given. I told about all these high quality cohort studies, about mechanistic evidence. And when I finished the talk, the chair was very kind and said, very nice presentations. I'm really inclined to believe that noise is not healthy, but where is the evidence? You only presented cohort study, this type of studies. It looks convincing, but we know from cardiovascular research, there's a lot of lifestyle confounding. We don't really trust cohort studies at all. So he made then really the point, we need intervention research. What type of intervention research is there available in the noise field? And obviously, it's much more difficult for environmental factors like noise and other factors to do randomized studies, as people would probably not very much agree to be randomized to a high noise area and to live there for the next 10, 20 years just to see whether they get a disease. So obviously, it's really much more tricky to get this type of research. But I agree. I mean, there's really a certain type of limitations that we have in this type of research. And with this type of research, I mean the classical cohort approach. The first point is exposure assessment. Jean-Marc Wunderli gave already quite a nice introduction about all the problems. If you do exposure assessment, there's always an uncertainty involved. But it's not only the modeling. I mean, it's even on a larger scale, there's uncertainty because we don't know exactly where people spend their time, how much relevant is it if they are exposed to noise during the day and are not at home and things like that. So all these aspects are very critical and difficult to consider. The other point is, of course, that we may also have a kind of implicit reverse causality, I call this. So we cannot exclude that maybe people who are particularly vulnerable to noise, they avoid to live in noisy areas, or they move out. And so the most vulnerable people who at least can afford to pay a little bit more for a more quiet flat may not be in an exposed area. So we also may miss this one. And then you have already heard about it. I mean, there's always a debate about confounding. Altogether, I don't want to say that we should do cohort research. I still think a good cohort is very important. But of course, if you do intervention research, if you find ways to do that, you can avoid some of this problem. It may be quasi-randomized, if not fully randomized. Exposure assessment, if the exposure changes in a certain area, the nice things about decibels is that basically you would expect similar decibels change everywhere. So somehow it makes things a bit easier in terms of exposure assessment and of quantifying effect. There's this nice paper in the framework of the WHO Europe guidelines about intervention studies, and Lex Brown and Irene van Kamp have then introduced this terminology for these 5 types of interventions in the field of noise. So the type A intervention is that you really change the emission so at the source that there's lower emission, like you have speed limits, you have low noise pavement, things like that. Type B is that you have changes on the path, or like noise barriers, sound windows, sound insulation, things like that. Type C is a kind of intervention which is maybe relevant for research, that you change an infrastructure from one place to another, like the Berlin airport that changed the place. So this offers then also opportunity to look into that. Then there's type D intervention, that you change other physical properties of the area, which may then affect the noise health effects. For instance, there's quite some research showing that if the green space is increased, that noise annoyance may change. And the 4th type is the type E intervention. So if you communicate, if you are transparent about noise, this may also affect how people react to noise. So for instance, if the noise is more predictable, if people know now we have for a certain period of time more noise because of construction site, people will usually perceive it better if they are informed about it as if it just happens. What is also very interesting in that paper, if you looked into what type of research has done, very little has been done on somatic outcomes like cardiovascular effects or things like that. So this type of research is really rare, and there's really a lack of this type of research. So here's a typical study done in Switzerland. I was not involved in that one, from Brink and colleagues, where they looked what happens if you introduce speed limits in an urban area. So they did at first 50 km/h speed, then they made a survey about noise annoyance, about quality of life issues and things like that. And then they repeated these surveys 6 months after a speed limit of 30 was introduced, and looked into the effects. And clearly what can be expected, the noise has been reduced when the speed was reduced. There was not the full amount of reduction you would expect if you reduce speed from 50 to 30, because of course still some people may not fully adhere to the speed, but still it's almost 2 dB reduction in noise, which is, if you would express it in a reduction in traffic flow, it's like almost 50, maybe like 1 point. How we should not half, but 50% reduction. So 75% of the traffic flow that you have. So it's quite some impact. But what is also interesting, and this has also been observed in other studies, if you look at the exposure response curves, and here the response is the percentage of highly annoyed people, one could see that actually these curves shifted to the left. So in addition that people were less exposed, they also at the same level of exposure, they were percentage of people was lower that was felt annoyed. And this was equivalent to like a dB extra reduction in noise during the day and a 4 dB extra reduction in the night. So for instance, if you look at 55 dBs before noise, before the speed was reduced, about 8% felt highly annoyed. Afterwards, at the same exposure levels, of course, these were different people because we have this shift in exposure, it was only 6%. So we have an extra effect of the intervention, and this is the so-called change effect. Of course, we don't have a control group here, so it might be also an intervention effect in the sense that if people are asked about noise and things like that, that they change their attitude to noise. So we cannot be 100% sure that it is a change effect from the intervention, but this is something which has often been observed in this type of study. We see also the opposite, actually. If the exposure increases, then people get more reactive than what you would expect. So the type of interventions that we have looked at may also be expanded by another type of intervention, which is maybe not a public health intervention, but which is an interesting intervention for research, and I call it the type R, like relocation of people. So if people move from one place to another, it may happen that they change their noise exposure, that they are less exposed than before, or that they are more exposed. So that is also kind of intervention that is interesting for research. Or there might be situations where we have quasi-random noise fluctuations because there's a source that is not always the same. So for typical road traffic noise, you would have always expected more or less the same pattern from day to day. And if there are exceptions, it's very difficult to know that in advance or to know it later. But for instance, for aircraft, this is not the case. So if you live around an aircraft, an airport, it may really depend on the weather situation, whether the planes come from the left or from the east or from the west and so on. And so we use this type of quasi-experimental situation where the noise at a certain place around the airport was sometimes very high and sometimes very low and changed from day to day for a type of case crossover study. So everybody in air pollution research is very familiar with that design. It has been very often used in this field, but it has not that often used so far in noise research. And this is a study that we did also with Jean-Marc, who was part of it, and also Daniel. So basically we looked into this area around the airport that was affected by the plane noise. We included all cardiovascular death between 2000 and 2015, which were about 25. And we also considered potential confounders, which in this case are not lifestyle factors because they don't change from day to day, but other factors that change from day to day with the exposure, like air pollution, temperature, and precipitation, we considered in our analysis. And indeed, we could see that if during the nighttime noise, that risk to die within 2 hours exposure windows increased significantly for all cardiovascular disease, ischemic heart disease, and myocardial infarction. And we saw also some trends which were nearly significant for ischemic stroke, arrhythmias, and heart failure. Interestingly, we didn't see any association for daytime death and the nighttime exposure before. We hypothesized that this could also be a factor, that if you have a bad night, that then you're distressed, and then even in this case, you could still have a delayed reaction during the day. We couldn't see that. We didn't look at daytime noise because we considered the uncertainty too high that people would not stay at home during the day, and then we cannot assign them the correct exposure. Similar results was also found around Heathrow Airport, just published maybe 2 years ago, where they looked also not only in death, but also in hospitalizations, and the numbers were even higher. And what is very interesting, significant effects were found for the early morning hours and the late evening hours, which I find very interesting because then the traffic is high, people are at home, so then most likely the exposure assessment is most accurate. So it makes a lot of sense that they see it for hospitalization. Actually, for death, they couldn't confirm our observations, but here the timing of the death was not for every hour, but only for the day. So in principle, it aligns with our findings that if you take the death during the whole following day, you don't see much, but it would be more closer really related to the nighttime exposure. Here a similar study or the similar design where we looked into noise and on-demand sedative and analgesic medications in a psychiatric patients that lived in an airfield, that lived in a it almost feels like living in an airfield, but they lived in a hospital very close to a military airport in the Alps, where you have a lot of noise. So sometimes it was even more than 100 decibels that you could measure the peak. So on the upper side of the slides, you see some measurements that we did indoor and outdoor when planes flew by. And what we could see, I don't want to go into detail given the time restrictions. Basically, we really could see that within 3 hours of noise events, and this is also highly irregular noise, a lot of the time there's no military aircraft noise, we could see that the on-demand medication consumption was increased. And very interestingly, we used different approach, and with the approach where we try to model indoor noise, we got the highest exposure response associations, and we interpret this finding as lowest exposure misclassification. Basically, we did a first study where we used 6 years of data, 2016 until 2021, and then we did an independent sample follow-up study with only 22 data, which found basically the same results, but of course with wider confidence intervals. And then we also used measured data instead of model data, and again found similar results, but the confidence intervals were a bit wider because we had only 1 year of measurement. So quite robust finding. So this is really a kind of intervention study in the sense that we have a kind of quasi-randomized noise application in the study collective. Now the next study that I would like to present is an analysis where we're currently working on, and the question is here really to use change in exposure from moving the place of residence. So we wanted to see what happens with people who lived originally in low exposure areas and then they moved to medium or high exposure areas, or the other way around, where the people who lived in high exposure areas and then go to medium or low exposure, whether we can see a benefit in their health. And we used our nationwide Swiss national cohort, where we basically really have long-time follow-up data, so we could really do survival analysis and see whether the survival curves changed after moving. And the inclusion criteria for that study, we wanted to have a stable baseline so that people have somehow that we were sure that they had a stable exposure during a certain time. So we included only people who were non-movers on 10 years up to follow-up. And then we have looked into follow-up from 2011 until 2018 and have then looked into these different terciles. And if I say we, then all the credit for this analysis goes to Danielle Vieno, who has conducted this analysis so far. We have adjusted for all these factors which were available from this registry-based cohort. They already explained a bit what are the pro and cons. We are also convinced, based on our experience, that confounding is not such a big thing, and in particular here, because we also compare people with themselves. Basically, we really compare how they move, how the survival curves changes when they move. And this is now the results for those who move from high to medium or low noise areas. We basically just defined high, medium, and low based on tercile. So that is why we have a bit odds number if you look at the second column, how this is defined, high, low, and medium. So high is the reference. We don't see that much of an effect for or associations for CVD mortality for the medium, but we see clearly a significant reduction for those who moved from high to low, and the same relatively similar effect estimates for natural mortality as well. If we go from CVD from low to medium or high, then we see for natural mortality the expected pattern with an exposure response function. For CVD mortality, we see a kind of increase, but by far not significant in the medium category and not at all in the high category. So that's a bit against the expectation we had. Then the second part of the project we are currently working on, I hope that I could present results, but we have not yet there, is then to really look into type A and B interventions using the same study base. So in Switzerland, there was quite a lot of noise barriers introduced. So you see in the different cantons, several hundred of kilometers noise barriers have introduced, and also low noise pavement. And so we have modeled what has been the exposure reduction at that places, and then also want to see whether this goes with a benefit. Basically, if you look at the whole population, then what you also have to realize that, of course, only a small proportion of the population profits from such measures. That's also in a way good, because only a small proportion has been very highly exposed. And expressed as a population weight, that means the exposure reduction is not that high. But if you, if 4% profit and you have minus 0.19, you can imagine that if that would be quite some reasonable reduction for these 4% on average that we can see. And here the same for low noise pavement. This is for railway noise, and that's for road traffic noise, the changes. Here a smaller part of the population is observed, but then of course the noise reduction is even higher for those who profit. Unfortunately, as I said, we haven't any results, but I just made a prediction and a burden of disease assessment. If you assume this change in exposure, if you look at the Swiss health data, and if you apply the exposure response function from cohort study, then what would the expected benefit would be that about every year one could prevent with this measure 133 deaths in Switzerland, which is around 0.2% of the population. When I presented that at the Urban Sound Symposium, then some people thought, okay, I want to say this is not really worth to do it, but I think that is not my message here. I think 133 deaths is quite a lot. If you, for instance, compare with the number of deaths by traffic accidents in Switzerland, this is around 250 every year. And Switzerland has a program to reduce these traffic accidents and spends every year 670 million Swiss francs for a year for that. And so basically, I think it's also justified that we do the same for protecting from noise-prevented death. And obviously, death is just a pyramid and the most severe things. I mean, certainly these noise barriers and low noise pavement, they prevent diseases, they prevent high sleep disturbance, high annoyance, cognition, concentrations. Would be very nice to measure that, but for that we don't have the database. To come to conclusion, basically, I think it's very important to do intervention research. It's an important puzzle for assessing causality. It's an additional level for the evidence. And I think we have to really consider that many interventions may come with co-benefits, but there's also a risk of side effects, or maybe sometimes there could also be side effects which are negative. But most of them, I think, come with co-benefits. For instance, speed reductions makes the places more interesting to spend there, maybe come with more social interaction because it's not so noisy and things like that. Interventions may have additional benefits which are called these change effects. Just because something is improving, it has even a better effect than what you expect just from the sound changes. And as I have said, interventions research is still scarce, and I really would encourage you to think about situations where you can do this type of research in your country and context. We have interesting new findings. And what we also see just from the box or from these exposure distribution functions, it's also quite a lot of effort to reduce noise once it's emitted. So with these noise barriers and low noise pavement, we can do something. But if we can prevent noise otherwise, that we have less traffic and so that it's even more efficient in reducing noise exposure in the situation. So that's all I wanted to say. Many thanks to my team who contributes, and in particular Daniel, Benedict, and Nicole, who also contributed to this specific type of research that we have done.
Thanks a lot, Martin. Yeah, so I see we have a few questions in the chat, but let's start with, I just see JW. Yeah, Jean-Marc, please go ahead, ask your question.
Yes, thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Martin, for this excellent presentation. I just wanted to comment on the two studies about triggering mortality. There again, we see the importance of exposure modeling. So there are two main differences between the two studies. Heathrow used idealized routes while we calculated each individual flight based on its radar tracks. And the other one is they calculated on a rather coarse grid. So the assigned level was sometimes hundreds of meters off. Yes, I think they might have found something with more accurate exposure data. Just a guess.
I mean, they also have found something. So I think it's as always. I think would certainly be helpful if the better the exposure assessment, the better the results. I just see one question in the chat about the mover lifestyle change. Indeed, I think that the mover in terms of interventions may be the least randomized one in that sense. The question is a bit those who move from high to high, whether you would expect so much different lifestyle changes than those from moving from high to low. But in principle, it could be. I mean, we have speculated a bit. For instance, why don't we see a benefit in cardiovascular mortality if you move, or why don't we see a risk if you move from low to high? And one very it's just speculation. One option was indeed that there could be some kind of confounding in the sense that if people and here we deal with mortality, so it's really an old population. If people decide to move from low to noise, these might be people who move from countryside to more urban areas because they are interested to go maybe to attend to culture. So this could be a kind of bias to a more healthy collective that decides to go in an urban place. But it's really just speculation. I agree that here we have probably this type of intervention study, we have probably the highest risk for confounding to some extent.
So you've been keeping, and I on the chat there did something else grab your attention. I did see the first comment was from Yaya Sun. I think this must relate to your talk, asking about confounding in the sense of the Zurich case crossover study, but I think you pretty much addressed that in your talk. In fact, I see you have your hand up, so please go ahead and ask your question. Say it.
Oh, thank you so much. At first, very importantly, is my first question. Would you be open to a collaborative opportunity to apply the same methods to study the US population? Because I was thinking it's very promising and we have some data here.
Yeah,
maybe
sure.
Cross-population study. Yeah. Thank you so much. Could you please share your email address for this purpose? Thank you so much.
So,
I think it was at the end of the presentation. I can also type it here.
Okay.
Oh, thank you so much.
I have the privilege of a very strange name, so you find me also very easily on Google.
I was going to say that all of our speakers, I think, are quite easily found on LinkedIn, and it sounds like everybody's interested in, follow-up questions by email. We've gone a little bit over time today, but yeah, so it's great that everyone is enthusiastic. I just want to read a nice little comment here from Charlie Roscoe that I see. She says, "Wonderful sessions. I hope there'll be a recording so that we can convince funders in the US to invest in high quality noise modeling here." So I think that was really one of the take home messages also, that all three of our speakers, who of course are coming from Europe, where we have these great noise models in relation to many other areas. So that was one of the things that we wanted to share. So, sorry, you still have your hand up. Do you have another question? Yes. If Martin, are you willing to stay for a few extra minutes?
Yeah, sure. No
okay, go ahead.
Just very quick question. In America, we did a lot of study, found significant funding on anxiety, depression, and ADHD. But I wonder, why European, today's speakers rarely talk about this outcome. What are the difficulties? Or why you're not interested?
I don't think we are not. I cannot only speak for me. I don't think that there's a lack of interest. I think it's very interesting. If you look into the noise literature, I feel the first papers are really about anxiety, about annoyance, about more this quality of life, and then somehow it switched to cardiovascular disease that get more focus. But there are interesting studies. I mean, there's also depression and noise, which has become more relevant. We have just recently done a burden of disease assessment for Europe, which will soon be published in this new EEA update, where we look into the depression from noise. I agree. I think it's a highly important topic, and we also. We have also looked into suicide and noise, and so also relations there as a tipping point somehow, maybe for the whole cascade of mental health problem below. So yeah, I
maybe
agree.
Interactions among the cardiovascular and maybe the anxiety, things like that. So my personal experience is that I'm living in a very noisy area, and I asked my neighbors, I said, did you hear anything? They said, oh, me and my husband, we're both deaf. So we have no problem of living here because. So have you there's a epidemiological term called the healthy worker effect. So, those who remain in the noisy area may already have a hearing deterioration. Do you think that would possible a confounder, or if we have a smaller sample size, if we can have a more detailed data collections, do you think that would be a good confounder to control of?
Yeah, I think it's inherently difficult to control for, but I agree that is what I meant with this implicit reverse causality, that really those people who stay may have reasons, and hearing problem may be one thing. Also, one has to also be careful. I think there are people, if you don't hear very well, not if you're deaf, but then you can get even more annoyed by noise because it needs more concentration than to listen to people. So I think it's not that hearing problem is associated with better noise tolerance in general. It's mainly only if you really have severe not hearing at all.
Great,
yeah,
thanks.
yeah.
So I'm going to jump in here. I see some people are starting to wish us well and say their goodbyes. We are running late. Sorry for our timekeeping. Just in the chat, we had a last note, sort of thanking all of our speakers. We were going to put up a slide, but let's bypass that. So Martin, thank you. Mette, thanks a lot. And Jean-Marc as well. I think this was a really excellent session. Very informative for all of us. In the chat, there is a note there that says, if you're not already, if you don't know if you're on our ISEE Special Interest Group or ICBEN Team 3 mailing lists, you can reach out to myself or Stephanie. We've put our email addresses there. So we have advertised this on social media. So some of you may not already be on these lists. But yeah, so again, just a big thanks also to Stephanie and to Junette for helping to organize this, and for all our speakers and all our interest from the audience today. We will do more, so we'll see you soon.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks a lot.
Because I'm thinking I have no